Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zechariah, after his father. But his mother said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "None of your relatives have that name." Then they began motioning to his father to find out what name he wanted to give him. He asked for a writing tablet and wrote.
Blessed be the God of Israel, who comes to set us free, who visits and redeems us, who grants us liberty. The prophet spoke of mercy, of freedom and release. God shall fulfill that promise and bring the people peace. God from the house of David, a child of grace has given. A Savior comes among us to raise us up to him. Before him goes the herald, forerunner in the way, the prophet of salvation, the harbinger of day. On those who sit in darkness, the sun begins to rise, the dawning of forgiveness on the sinner's eyes. God guides the feet of pilgrims along the paths of peace. Oh, bless our God and Savior with songs that never cease. I have a son. Can you believe it? Isn't God amazing? It's still hard for me to believe. I mean, there was no way that Elizabeth and I should be able to have a child. Yes, I'm a priest, and Elizabeth is from a priestly family, and yes, we live righteously and follow all of God's commandments. And well, I guess when you think that way, then it's a surprise that we weren't having children. But we weren't. We had no children, and the idea of having children was becoming hopeless. I was old. Elizabeth was barren and getting older. Some believe that Elizabeth's barrenness was a judgment against her by God. And some rabbis teach that a man without a wife or a man with a wife and no children was close to excommunication from God. We didn't know why we didn't have children. But we didn't. But now we do. And he's going to be a prophet and prepare the way for the Lord. Israel hasn't had a prophet since Malachi. And so I guess in some ways Israel is as hopeless now as Elizabeth and I were. But the Lord is coming to fulfill God's promise of redemption. And my son is going to lead the world in preparing for Christ. My son. I keep thinking back to the day when this all started for Elizabeth and I. I should have known something big was going to happen, and if it did, that I would know. My name is Zechariah, which means God has remembered. So if God's going to remember God's people, then I should be one to recognize. And then there was the casting of the lots, which chose me and showed that God chose me to sacrifice the incense, to share the incense in the sanctuary, which is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that most priests never get. And then, of course, there was Gabriel coming out of nowhere, scaring almost the rest of my life out of me. But yet I didn't. For some reason, I didn't believe. I should have believed. I wish I would have believed. But I didn't. It just seemed too impossible for Elizabeth and I to have a child now. Do you know what it's like to be mute for over 9 months? To be cut off from the world? I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. Not upon my worst enemy, and not even upon my spouse. To be in solitude, isolated, unable to share anything with the world around you, unable to communicate with anyone, have an impact on anything. I wasn't even able to bless the people of Israel who were praying for me outside the temple while I was in it. I muted myself because I didn't believe. But in those 9 months, those 9 long months and lonely months, I had time to think and pray and reflect. And I think I realized maybe one reason why God muted me. Because by not believing that God could do what God wanted to do, I was trying to mute God. I was isolating God from the world, trying to cut God off, saying, God, you can't do that in this world. That's not the way things are done. It's impossible. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to try to mute God. But it just seemed too complicated and too impossible. I didn't believe. But of course, I didn't mute God, and I can't mute God. Because God is unmutable. If God has a plan, God will carry out that plan. And no one or no thing is going to get in God's way. John is an example, is proof that God is unmutable. When God has a plan, you either get on the camel or you get passed by. And this is a humongous plan. I mean, this is the biggest plan that God has ever had. The redemption of God's people. But I got passed by because I muted myself. I didn't believe that God could do what God wanted to do, and instead I believed that I wasn't able to do what God wanted me to do. And it may have even kept me from having a part in God's plan. I have my son, and I am thankful for John. But who knows what greater role I could have played in God's plan to redeem God's people. I couldn't even share the message of Gabriel to those around me. I couldn't share what God had done in my life, the miracles. I couldn't share the message of what God was doing for the world. And instead, because I was mute, I disconnected myself. Because I didn't believe that God could use me as God desired. And who knows, I could have even begun the work that my son John would complete and prophesy the coming of the Lord. I almost missed naming my son, which is my prerogative as a father, because in naming John, I claim John as my own. But then again, I guess I didn't name John. God did. And so John isn't necessarily mine, but God's. And God has a plan for John. And God carried out that plan even though I didn't believe it. John is going to prophesy and prepare the world for the Lord. From the very beginning, John is named, claimed, and aimed by God. And John has been given the ability to carry out that plan, as all of us have. So believe. God has a plan. God has a plan to complete God's promise, to carry out God's promise of peace and redemption for God's people. And God is calling John and myself and all of us to help carry out that plan. So believe that God has a plan for you and that God will carry out that plan even if it seems too impossible. I lived a priestly life. I lived righteously, but when I came in the presence of God and God called on me, I didn't believe. And I muted myself. And maybe even limited my involvement in God's plan. So believe, because we are all in the presence of God, and God has a plan to redeem the world, and God is calling each and every one of us to take part. So believe. Even when it seems impossible, believe.